Deathstranding is a game made by Kojima Productions where you play as a character named Sam Bridges, played by Norman Reedus, and are tasked with connecting all these different groups to the chiral network and bringing back together the UCA, making lots of deliveries along the way. Death Stranding was a game that had a very confusing launch from what I remember. The game was pretty widely disliked upon launch. Just about every review YouTuber I used to watch back in the day was just taking absolute dumps on it, talking about how terrible it was, how much of a fall from grace it was for Kojima Studios. It was just absolutely getting eviscerated by the review community. And it was partially due to this just complete evisceration that I wasn't even going to try the game. I don't typically base my views on what I see of a game on what others think. However, people I almost always agree with were talking about how terrible it was. Just about everyone was in unanimous agreement that this was not a great game. But for whatever reason, I still don't really know what it was, but I kept being drawn back to it. I never played it, but I kept wanting to. Every year on Christmas, my parents will normally go out and get a few video games for me. They normally like to ask me to make a big list so that I don't know exactly what I'm going to get. And I prefer it that way too. And this past year, I just decided to write down several games I was thinking of. Most of them were ones that I genuinely wanted, but for some reason, I wrote down Death Stranding. I still don't really remember why I wrote that game down, because it's not one that I was necessarily even thinking about at the time. It was just one that I wrote down probably because it was one of the first games I could think of. But regardless, I didn't expect to get it. But lo and behold, that Christmas Day when I was opening my gifts and I got to the video games they bought me, it was one of the few that they bought. And at first, I was like, oh, okay, I don't even remember writing this down, but I was actually pretty excited. It was a game I've heard so much about, but still knew basically nothing of. So I was actually really excited to dive into it. Now, as of recording this video, I have successfully completed the main story and all the bonus content included in the director's cut version of the game, which is the version that I got, and I am steadily working towards a 100%. I can go ahead and say before I begin that I was very pleasantly surprised with Death Stranding. I think that it has a lot going for it as a game, and that's what I'd like to go into with the contents of this video. I just think that, honestly, Death Stranding is a misunderstood masterpiece. I think that one of the biggest problems with Death Stranding, at least in the beginning, was definitely the marketing strategies made in order to promote this game. I remember being very confused as to what it was even supposed to be. Almost like Kojima Studios was kind of embarrassed of what Death Stranding was. I remember basically all of the teaser trailers and promotional trailers showed no gameplay at all. Just showing these very abstract, like, images and, like, showing the BB and stuff. I mean, like, yeah, I guess that I can't really think of a perfect way to market the game, but at the very least, you didn't show people at all what they were getting into. I had no idea what kind of game this even was until reviewers started talking about it. But it became very clear that this was very obviously a walking simulator, something in the same vein as something like Journey, only it had some combat elements as well. And this type of game definitely has an audience that I think would have really enjoyed a game like this, especially if it was marketed to them as such. However, for whatever reason, I don't know if this was on PlayStation's side or Kojima's side, I really don't know. But they basically avoided this entirely. I had no idea that was the type of game that this was, heck, really, up until playing it. I knew vaguely that that's what it was, but I thought that maybe that would just be kind of, half of it and then half of it would be combat. But no, this game is very much so a walking simulator with a few combat elements sprinkled in here and there, as well as some stealth. But I think that one of the real nails in the coffin was when Kojima tried to say that this was a new type of game called a strand type game. I don't really know what came over him or the team that told him to say that. I have no freaking idea. But this is not a new type of game. This game has been done many a time before. The term strand type game, I can only assume he made up as thinking that like this game was unique enough to deserve its own genre. But no, this is a walking simulator game with some minor combat and stealth elements. That is how I would describe Deathstranding to anyone who asked me what it was. And like I said, up until its release, nobody knew what this was. And I'm sure that for reviewers who are used to Kojima games, a walking simulator was probably the last thing that they were expecting, especially with all of the really weird atmospheric shots they were showing in all of the teasers leading up to this moment. And I think that if this game was marketed properly, that it would have helped it out in the review community tremendously, as it would have at least told people before diving in, hey, this is not Metal Gear Solid. This is an entirely new thing, and it's okay that it's this new thing, but it's a walking simulator. So don't come in here thinking it's going to be, Metal Gear Solid 6 or whatever they're on now. This is its own thing. I think that was one of the biggest problems with the game at launch, was that nobody really even knew what this was. And once it came out, there were a lot of people who were disappointed with the product because I think they were expecting something a lot different. With the introduction out of the way, I'd like to actually start discussing the game now. I'd like to discuss what I think was really good about it and then discuss some of the bad later. But for now, let's focus on the good things. I think that there is a lot going for it. At the beginning of this video, I said this is a misunderstood masterpiece, and I 100% stand by that claim. This game blew me away in so many departments, and heck, I would actually even say it's probably in one of my top games of all time now that I've played it this much. It has just this weird atmosphere, and, well, we'll get into it. Let's start off with the movement. So, obviously, in a walking simulator, the main thing that you're going to be doing is walking. And I think that one of the biggest challenges with that is how do you turn walking into something, well, that's fun. That is a very daunting task. And just about every other walking simulator type game that I've played, they don't really focus on this. They more so try to immerse you in the atmosphere, and that is a perfectly fine approach. But Deathstranding really kind of leaned into the walking part, as they've made it very diverse. And I think that you can truly see how diverse it is by the scanning mechanic they've added in, where you can kind of scan the ground and it will show you like areas that are good to walk on, areas that are like to walk on, then areas that are like bad to walk on. And it just shows you how every little speck of the ground has been put into some category, and that is honestly pretty insane. There has obviously been a lot of work sunk into the landscape and how it affects your movement, and I think the end product is really, really good. I think that one of the things that that a lot of people don't talk about is that the walking is not bad. I have heard people say that the movement in this game is one of the biggest problems. However, what I have to say to them is that they must not have taken the time to really pick apart how the movement works in this game. It is very different. You can't just walk in a straight line or just like horse glitch your way up a mountain. You actually have to sit down and think logically about how you're going to progress, kind of like you would in real life if you were trying to overcome a mountain yourself. And I think that in this way, they've ended up making one of the most engaging walking simulators that I've ever played, because they've pretty much turned the landscape into something almost like a puzzle. Say, for example, you're trying to cross a big mountain. Well, you could always double back and go around it, but what if there's something particular on top that you need to get? Well, you need to stand back and really analyze the type of stuff you're going to need before you tackle that object. Like, are you going to need ladders? Are you going to need ropes? Are you going to, how many of those things you're going to need? Are you going to need carriers? What is the best way to get up the mountain with said ladders? There are just so many variables that you have to take into effect that it really kind of becomes like a bit of a puzzle, like I mentioned earlier. I think that the key to really getting into the flow of the movement with Death Stranding is patience. Patience is absolutely the key here. And it's something that most gamers, including myself at some points, do not have a lot of. I remember there was one section of the game, towards the middle of it, where you were at this one outpost that is right outside of a mule camp, and the mule camp is completely covered by these canyons and caverns, so that when you fall, it is very, very bad. Most of the time you die, or if you do fall down there, there's not an easy way out, and if you don't have a ladder, you're going to be doing a lot of walking in this winding maze. If you take your time and be patient, getting through this area is a breeze. But if you're like me and you were trying to force your way through with like a motorcycle or something, yeah, it's not going to go well. You're probably going to fall, and it's going to be not a great time. So patience is key, but I will say this, if you are patient, it is very satisfying to overcome some of these obstacles flawlessly. It really helps you to feel like you have climbed a mountain yourself, even though you just did it in some video game. While I'm kind of on this topic of movement, I would like to go ahead and talk about driving. Driving was one of the most widely criticized part about the game. There are a couple vehicles to choose from. There is the bike, and there's a truck, and there are lots of different variations of said bike and truck. And people pretty much unanimously said, yeah, no, this sucks. I don't think it sucks. I think it's fine. I think why people think it sucks is because they're trying to ram these bits of transport through areas where they're not supposed to go. And I know that to some people that probably sounds annoying. Like, well, why can't I drive my bike or my truck anywhere I want to go? Well, I think the simple fact of the matter is that it would make the game too easy if you could do that. Like, there has to be some bit of struggle in your part from one point to the other. Otherwise, what's the true point? And there are games where there doesn't have to be a struggle. But in Death Stranding, it's obviously made it known that it wants you to struggle with the terrain. It wants you to fight against it like you would in real life. And if you just had made vehicles super overpowered, where they could just drive anywhere and do anything, it would kind of nullify that. Another thing to note is that if you do manage to just ram your bike through areas where it's not supposed to go, the driving gets very wonky. You'll realize that some of the physics aren't 100% fleshed out, and you can kind of glitch it into some very weird spots and positions. But I think that on the flatlands and kind of muddy, bumpy terrain where it wants you to drive, it works very well. I guess that my main thing to say about it would be just don't try to force it anywhere it's not supposed to be, and it'll work perfectly fine. Another thing I'd like to talk about is the cast. One thing that I think Death Stranding has a very positive aspect of is its cast of characters. And not just the characters, but the people who play said characters. Now, I'm not a very big movie buff. I don't know a lot of the actors that were in this game. But I did know Norman Reedus and a couple others. And the ones I knew, they didn't distract me from the game at all. Every actor or actress that was attached to one of these characters almost felt like the role was designed for them. It is really, really good. And let me highlight, Norman Reedus does a fantastic job. Like, I used to think that Daryl from The Walking Dead was going to be his magnum opus, but absolutely not. Sam Bridges is my favorite performance he has ever done, and I doubt to ever see it topped. It really does just feel like Kojima saw Norman Reedus and was like, I have got to make a character for this guy, because it just blends together so well. I'll talk about the acting a little bit later. I just go ahead and give you a bit of a spoiler. I don't think the acting is necessarily the best thing ever. However, the characters and actors and actresses connected to said characters is perfect casting. One of the more overlooked parts of the game is its soundtrack. And it was something that I had heard almost nobody talk about. So I assumed it would be kind of, like Breath of the Wild in a sense where there's basically no soundtrack. However, there's actually a pretty beefy one, and it is awesome. Like, I wish I could play some of it for you here. However, most of it is copywritten music that I can't play in our video without this video being copyright stricken. But like, it has some songs by Low Roar and a couple other bands I never heard of before. But the Low Roar songs in particular, even though they weren't made for this game apparently, seem like they were. They really do a good job of setting the kind of atmosphere that this game has. It's very somber. The music is super atmospheric. Nothing quite too in your face, but not so quiet that you can't hear it. The soundtrack is really nice. The only other thing I'd like to say about it is that you don't really get to hear it all that much. You only get to hear it come into the overworld whenever you're making certain deliveries. But besides that, it's almost entirely relegated to just being on your music player in your private room. I don't know why you can't play the music from your cufflinks, for example. I think that'd be a good thing to add, where whenever you're just exploring the world, you can kind of listen to the music on your cufflinks. That would be cool. But regardless, the soundtrack is fantastic and underrated. Definitely go and check that out. The atmosphere of this game is also something that I think is fantastic. I would say that the main sort of adjectives I'd use to describe it is dark and weird. It is so weird and so dark, but man, do I love it. It's got the BTs, the BBs, the beach. All this stuff is super cool. And I know if you haven't played the game, all those things I just said don't make any sense at all. And honestly, I kind of don't want to explain them too much because it'd ruin it for you if you haven't played the game. But let's just say that it's almost like a Tim Burton thing. It's so weird, but it works. Like, the story does a good job of really showing you the kind of the weirdness and dark sort of twisted manner of it all. And it really flows together perfectly to make this atmosphere that you don't see a lot in games, but man, I love it. And it's such a cool kind of world to explore. Honestly, I would say it's more compelling to explore than something like Breath of the Wild, as it's just so different. You know what? I would actually put it in line pretty similarly to something like a Dark Souls game, where the atmosphere is just so grim and weird. Only extra emphasis on the weird. There's a lot of weird stuff, like how you have a literal baby that you hook up to help you sense demon things, and you, and like the rain makes things age rapidly. I'll get into some of that stuff a little bit more later, but basically the atmosphere is freaking sweet. Another thing that I think is undervalued, but is a really good thing, is that this game is not cryptic at all. To some players, this might be a disappointment, as I know that some people like having their open world games to be a bit harder to figure out, where they have to do a lot of exploring on their own and backtracking to kind of figure out what they want to do. As for me, I don't like that. I like to know where I'm going, and I like to know what I'm doing. Death Stranding lays out from your first mission, okay, that thing you just did, that's what you're going to be doing for the rest of the game. And to some people, that might not sound appealing. But to me, I was like, okay, sick. Now I can really focus on perfecting this and getting better at it in the specific situations it throws at me, and because I'll always know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. Just being able to completely immerse yourself without having to ever worry about needing like a walkthrough or anything. It's just something that's so nice. That's such an overlooked thing in open world games now. They're always like, oh, we gotta stick a dungeon in the middle of nowhere so you can get this one specific item, and we don't give you enough hints. Oh yeah, because we want to like either waste tons of your time to find this thing or make you look up a walkthrough. Why would they do that? Even like in the new game plus stuff that I'm doing now, I'm not having to use walkthroughs. It's all very simple and straightforward, and I really like it. It makes it a nice checklist sort of game, and if that's something you're into, this is going to be great for you. And for the last part of this segment where I discuss the good things of the game, I would like to discuss probably the most opinionated segment of this entire video, and that is the itch. What I mean by that is that this game scratches a very particular itch for me. I'm sure that we all have games like this. Games are when we play them, it gives us a certain level of satisfaction that just no other game can in whatever specific area that it is. Like for some people, that's Pokemon. A lot of people have problems with the modern Pokemon formula. However, just doing that classic grinding is satisfying to some people. And in a very similar sense, Death Stranding does something similar. And I think that a big part of that is the maintenance aspect that this game brings. Like I mentioned earlier, rain makes things age and deteriorate more rapidly than normal. So you are having to replace equipment and things decently often. I say decently often, but give me a second and I'll explain. So maintenance is something that is kind of baked into the Death Stranding experience. And at first, this might be a turnoff to a lot of people. For example, like in Breath of the Wild, when you use a weapon too much, it breaks. And a lot of times, this isn't something that's endearing, it's something that's annoying. Because you're like, dadgummit, I'm in the middle of this very important thing, and my stupid sword broke out of nowhere because I can only use it like 7 times, and now I have to go get a new one. Like, yeah, don't get me wrong, that's annoying. But Death Stranding's not like that. It makes it very, very clear when things are going to break, and they don't just break out of nowhere. They gradually break, and you should be very well aware before they do. It makes it so that you're constantly upgrading or refurbishing your arsenal, and it really makes you have to think ahead for those longer journeys. And while it might not seem like a lot, it really ties a nice bow over the top of this game that I think gives it a really unique spin. Something where the maintenance is not an annoying, like, side part, but something that was baked in from the very beginning. It makes it so that doing things like replacing your shoes or bringing extra equipment because some of it might deteriorate, or recycling almost broken stuff to get more material, feels that much better. It actually makes it really satisfying whenever you have correctly prepared for a long mission. That sort of maintenance satisfaction is something that I can confidently say I have not seen in a game yet. Like in Breath of the Wild, it was annoying. In Animal Crossing, it was annoying. In Minecraft, it's annoying. It's always annoying. But here, it was actually good, and not just good, but it scratched a very specific itch that I had, and it's wonderful. It makes me want to just keep playing it over and over and over again. Now that we've got done discussing the good things, I'd like to focus on a couple of the bad things. Um, Let me iterate before I get into this, because I'm going to get pretty deep, that I think this game is great. It is fantastic, even. However, I do think that it stumbles in a couple places where I think would greatly improve the game if a little bit more focus was put on in these two areas in particular. What I will say is that there's a Death Stranding 2 coming out soon, as well as a movie. And if these two things can be rectified, I think that those things could very easily be landmarks in media. Death Stranding 2 has potential to be my favorite game of all time. So I'm really going to kind of beat in hard these parts that I think are rough about the game, because I feel so passionately in the potential that Death Stranding has. First, let's talk about the combat. Combat really feels like the only thing that wasn't thought of from the very beginning of the game. Um, it just feels like during development, somebody was playing and like, man, I'm just kind of walking around a lot and not really like fighting anything. I wish I was fighting something. And they were just like, oh, well, I guess let's shoehorn in some combat last minute. Because that's exactly what it feels like they did. Um, it just ends up being very sluggish, and it lacks a lot of difficulty. Well, I guess if you're not prepared correctly, it could end up being a bit more of a problem, but it almost never is. At the beginning of the game, they give you this little shotgun, shock, not shot, shotgun, kind of like a taser or something. But basically, this gun sucks. Like, you have to like shock someone with it and then hold the trigger on them. But if you miss, you have to kind of wait a little bit for it to recharge, adding this weird sort of staggering to how you're supposed to shoot it. And at first, I actually thought it was okay. So I was like, well, yeah, the gun sucks, but in a way, they're kind of discouraging combat, wanting you to be more stealthy. And yeah, I'm kind of into that. Until the very next gun and onward, they give you so many options for combat, and they just make you overpowered, where you are an unstoppable machine that cannot be stopped by anything. You are just way too strong. And I don't really know specifically how to address this problem. Maybe make the guns suckier. I don't know, but it just felt so thrown together. At the beginning, I thought that there might, be a little bit of depth, but no, not at all. It's so easy too. Like, it's laughably easy. And let me highlight, this is any part of combat. So this includes the boss fights. Oh yeah, there are boss fights. And what I will say is that the boss fights are actually a really cool spectacle. Like, they look awesome. But for any of you that played Breath of the Wild, quick spoilers if you have, or haven't. But at the end of the game, whenever you fight Ganon, whenever he turns into like the big pig at the end, and you're just shooting him with Zelda's bow, well, that's basically every single boss fight in Death Stranding to a T. Like, I'm not even joking. That is it exactly. Where the monster kind of just stands there, or the big BTs will sort of just stand there and not move that much, and you'll just kind of shoot them over and over until they die. Uh, there are only a couple instances where this is not the case. Like, for a couple of the boss fights, you go into this other dimension and fight the BB's dad, and it's kind of like a war zone. And those sections look really cool. Again, the spectacle's great. but the fight itself is very easy and kind of pathetic. I think that probably the closest they got to a good spot of combat in the entire game was whenever you fight Higgs when he's controlling like the big giant BT with Amelie inside. That fight is actually kind of intense. He's just throwing a lot at you at once, and you're having to shoot specific parts of the giant BT. And it's not super difficult, but it requires you to do a lot of micromanaging, adding a pretty unique spin to the combat up until this point. I think it's actually a pretty good fight. It's really the only one I remember feeling satisfied with after getting a victory. But every other part of the game, the combat sucks. The BTs are something I'd like to talk about briefly really quick. They were a cool concept at first. Let me explain them just very, very briefly. The BTs, in case you don't know, they are kind of like these souls of people who have died, and they're in this weird limbo state in between life and death, and they can mess you up pretty bad. They're invisible to the human eye. However, if you're someone that has dooms, you can sense, or in some cases I believe you can even see them. Sam Bridges, the main character that you play as, has dooms as well, and by hooking up to the BB, he can actually see BTs, and this is how you kind of have to maneuver around them in the game. Something to note is that they are invisible until you stand completely still, or if you make the BB happy and his senses kind of extend a little bit. Why this is important is because it makes these sections really tense. You'll go through BT areas and you're having to be really quiet and sneak through as your little like indicator thing on your shoulder will sort of play hot and cold with them and blink faster and turn different colors depending on how close they are to you. And if you get too close and one sees you and starts sort of stomping after you, you can hold your breath and sort of sneak away, because I'm guessing that they can't see you either. They must be relying completely on sound. And at first, this was like a really creepy and cool sort of interaction. But towards the end of the game, it just becomes really annoying. Like, yeah, it's cool at the beginning, and it's cool at a couple different parts where it's pretty stressful. But overall, it's just annoying. Like, I don't know. I do still think the concept is cool. And it adds a lot to that atmosphere I was talking about. Like, it adds so much to that atmosphere. And it's one of the big main parts of the game. But dang it, it's annoying. The only other enemies you'll fight are the mules, and these will be the bulk of your combat interactions. They're just these terrorists. That's basically their whole story. And they're very incompetent. They will never kill you. On the hardest difficulty of this game, which I'm currently playing it on, the mules are completely powerless against me. I can defeat an entire legion, army of mules by myself with a freaking bola gun, and it won't even be close. Mules are completely useless. Just highlighting why I think the combat in this game is so bad. So, just to wrap up my thoughts on that, the combat should be something that is built in from the very beginning. If this was, it needs improvement, because it does not feel that way at all. This needs to be something that's fleshed out way more if we're going to see it come back in the sequel. But I think that if done right, it can actually be a good part of the game. It'll kind of help to mix things up. I don't think combat's a bad idea. I just think it should be done differently. Now let's talk about my last point, and kind of where I want to start to wrap up the video and finish talking about the bad parts of the game. And let's talk about the story. This is something I'm sure everyone was expecting to be in here, and yes, it's here. Let me go ahead and address something I said in the good parts of the video. I do think that the casting is good, but the acting, it's kind of hit or miss for me. I just feel like some of the exchanges are really weird. I don't know if this was because of like the way it was animated, or if there was some sort of language barrier that was maybe cutting off how some of the lines are said. I really don't know, but some of the exchanges just feel so awkward. Some of them feel really natural though. It's really hit or miss. I don't know. Again, I think the casting is great, but some of the acting is pretty rough. But let's not hit too hard on the acting. Let's kind of go more into the story itself and its structure. I think that structure wise, at the beginning, it does great. Like when it starts, it's perfect. It's like, okay, Sam, here's the goal, here's what you have to do. And as you're doing it, it slowly starts to drip feed you information about the world, about the BB, about the BB's dad, his origins, about Sam's origins, about Higgs, about Fragile, and it's all pretty natural. Like I do think that the cutscenes at points can be pretty long, but for the most part, the story is structured decently until the game gets towards the end. It just completely flies off the rails, like just soars off of them into the side of a freaking mountain. So the story goes from being like competent, where it's like, okay, yeah, you need to connect to the UCA and save Amelie. That's your main goal. And along the way, you're starting to learn all these different things, and the story's getting a bit more complex, but it's still competent. You understand what's going on, and you have a clear end goal in mind. But at the end, it decides, hey, this story has been like decent. Let's completely ruin it now because we don't want anything competent now, do we? For whatever reason, at the end of this game, it decides to just information dump on you, and you really have no way out of it. Whenever you were in like middle school or whenever you started writing essays, one of the main things a teacher probably told you is don't add new information in the conclusion. Like in the conclusion, you should be wrapping up all of the loose ends that you brought up in the rest of your paper. Well, whoever wrote the story of Deathstranding obviously was never taught this, because the end of the game is literally just an information dump. And a lot of it's new information too. Information that doesn't even matter. Basically, the back 3 or 4 hours of the game is just a big, long cutscene. I mean, it's broken up by small bits of gameplay, but I am not exaggerating. The end of this game is at least 3 hours long, and it is just almost solid cutscene. Now, you can skip it, but there are also parts that you can't skip. It's so weird. It's such a bad way to end the game, and instead of tying off like a decently competent story, it ends up just adding this really confusing bow on the top of it all, and it's almost completely due to Amelie's character. So up until this point, you don't really know much about Amelie's character at all. Just the fact that like Sam cares about her a lot. Well, you end up finding out that Amelie was like never real, and Amelie was really like Sam's mom, maybe? You know, I've already played this game through twice, and I couldn't really tell you. What I will say, though, is that Amelie's existence is confusing. Instead of making it straightforward and just making her the character she said she was, maybe just with some special properties or something, no. They had to go and make it weird. Not to mention, they make the BB's origins weird, too. The BB's origins are kind of sprinkled throughout the entire story, where you find little breadcrumbs about it as you play. And it's actually pretty good. Until the end, when they just completely vomit a bunch of information on you about it that doesn't even make sense. It's so frustrating. As someone who can see that the base story was perfectly fine, not perfect. Like, don't get me wrong, this was not a perfect story but it was a competent one that would have done a fine job of laying out the groundwork for what this game would kind of run off of, and then they just completely ruined it at the end. I think that they could have fixed this by just removing all that complexity with Amelie's character and just taking out the information dump at the end. But hey, there's a second game along the way, so maybe it'll clear up some of these things and do a lot better of pacing the story and not information dumping at the end. I think that we could really see a great story come out of this game if it takes the good stuff about the original and just reworks it. I think that the second game has great potential for a good story. One last thing I'd like to mention about the story, and this doesn't really even apply to the game, but a Death Stranding movie has been announced. I have no idea how they're gonna freaking do that because, like, just the end cutscenes of this game is like 3 hours. So, I mean, I'm excited to see how they approach this from a creative standpoint because I have no idea how they're gonna do it. There a lot of parts of this game are integral to understanding how it works, so they are probably going to have to make some really weird cuts or compress certain parts, and we'll see if it makes it better or worse. And with that, I will conclude the last section of my video and enter the conclusion. I think that the game does have flaws. Obviously, I just spent like 10 minutes talking about how bad the flaws were and how much they hinder the game. But at the end of the day, I'm dead serious. This ends up being one of my favorite games of all time. It's just the things it does right. It does so right. I cannot emphasize that enough. I might not have even done it justice at the beginning, but the good things are fantastic. It has me so excited for the future of this series. I think that Death Stranding 2 has great potential, and if it addresses these bad things that I mentioned, could very well end up being one of my favorites, if not my favorite game of all time. And the movie, I think, also has potential. The casting's great. Just kind of refine how some of those deliveries are made and exchanges, and I think you have a actually really good movie on your hands. Again, I don't really know how they're going to do it, but it's exciting to kind of think about it, I guess, because I don't know how the heck they're going to do it. But basically, that's going to be the video. I want to just highlight again that I think that Death Stranding is fantastic and is certainly a misunderstood masterpiece.